I'm Graham Broadbent. I lecture in law at Kingston University, and in this lecture we're going to be looking at the way legislation is made and also the making of delegated legislation. As we've seen before, Acts of Parliament are the most authoritative source in the domestic sphere, and so it's very important that we can identify Acts of Parliament as a source of law and that we can deal with what Parliament puts out in an Act of Parliament. And we'll be looking in a future lecture at the interpretation of statutes. There's no blueprint for making law in this country. It's largely a haphazard process and to a large degree reflects the political priorities of the government of the day. The government controls the parliamentary agenda, and it's not surprising to find that the measures proposed by the government tend to find their way into law. It follows from this that some areas of law have been subject to a lot of statutory change and a lot of statutory regulation. Other areas have been neglected. And it's hard to rationalise this particular process other than in the competing priorities of everyday politics. Parliament may decide to put forward ideas for legislation. The government may particularly want to do this. This is often in the form of a green paper, nowadays usually known as a consultation paper, usually put out by the government, which indicates the way that they're thinking